So so we talk about half Earth and 30 by 30 and 50 by 50, and that's all well and good. But I focus on the other half of the Earth, the half that we use to live on in a more day in, day out basis, and that we have altered, not irrevocably, but certainly substantially. And the production of food is the major driver of habitat and biodiversity and even ecosystem services loss around the planet. As I've said many times, if it comes to a choice between cutting a tree or feeding a child, the child's going to win every time. And so here's the reality in the lifetime of this particular group, at least in my lifetime. I think that's kind of yours too. We've gone from 2.5 billion people on the planet to 8.2 billion since we were born. The people are bigger, 20 to 25% bigger. They live longer, nearly 30 years longer. They eat more, they eat differently, and they have more money to spend on food. Since 1980, food production has doubled. Global trade in food has increased 4 times, so that the speed of trade has increased even faster than production of food. And trade represents about 30% of globally produced food. Trade is critical for sustainability. Comparative advantage is real. It's also critical for food security, and about 25 to 30% of countries now depend on food imports to keep people from starving. It's also important to address climate change by having the ability to produce food in different parts of the world when the weather is better in any given year, or the climate hasn't heated as much. All of this is to say that where and how we produce food is critically important, and it's going to become even more so. Now, let's look at that through the climate lens. Global food produces about 30 to 35% of greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that for all sectors, really, we need absolute reductions on the order of 60 to 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. For food, we also need that for soil health. We need to improve soil health. We need it for water use. We need it for water pollution. We need it for habitat. We need it for ecosystems and for biodiversity. So food is even more complicated. We know how to reduce emissions 60 to 80% for transport and for energy. We haven't done it yet, and we're slow to do it. We're still actually increasing emissions, but at least the technology is available and it can be done. There is no silver bullet for food. It's a lot more complicated. So here's what we know. The least efficient 10 to 20 producers on the planet for food, any food commodity, cause about 60 to 80% of the impacts. This applies to soil health, it applies to deforestation, but it also applies to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, those same 10 to 20% produce about 5% of the crops. So to date, we've really focused on how to reward the better producers, how to move them along. If we're going to reduce impacts absolutely by 60 to 80%, there's no way we can do that without moving the bottom. And our strategies need to focus now on the worst performers and how to get them into something else, how to make them better, or how to pivot them from commodity crop production to producing carbon sequestration and environmental services, and bringing nature back into farming. We focus on nature in the areas of pristine nature, but we need to start bringing nature into farming to increase productivity, to increase pollinators, to increase stream flow and continuity over time, the quality of the water, et cetera. So how do we shift subsidies away from old crops and old programs towards the new ones we need to be more resilient in the face of climate change? How do we help farmers retire? Half of global farmers and ranchers are over 54 to 60 degrees, 60 years. And so they are less efficient, but simply by stopping producing commodities, they could produce more carbon. they could produce other environmental services. And with those funds, we've heard a lot about harmful subsidies and the need to get rid of them. I would argue we don't really want to get rid of the subsidies. We want to pivot how they're used. We want to use them to encourage innovation, to ensure early actors so that they come up with the innovations that we need in a changing world. And we need to focus our government programs not on the adoption of practices, but on the production of results. How do we produce more using less land? We've achieved peak land. Now we need to achieve peak greenhouse gas emissions, peak water use, and begin to get to these absolute reductions. All of this happens in the US in the Farm Bill at a federal level, but it also happens at a local level around food waste, around composting, around environmental practices, and other types of concessions for land use for farming. But I think the final thought that I want to leave you with is that going forward, given our dependence on trade, and every country is dependent on trade, we've got to figure out how to manage the planet, not just how to manage a farm or a county or a state or a country. All of our supply chains are global, and we compete, but we also depend on those global markets. So from an environmental point of view, trade agreements are a huge issue to get right.